Hello and welcome to the College Football Focus podcast, talking about obviously this upcoming week, Saturday's main slate of college football action. And I'm Big Italy 42. He is Spencer Limbach at Spencer_JL. Of course, this is your article you wrote up as you do every week. And the first player on this board here, probably going to come as no surprise to anyone who follows college football at all. Seth Russell from Baylor, 9,800 on FanDuel, 9,000 on DraftKings. And you mentioned you like him a little bit more on DraftKings where he's cheaper. But, I mean, this guy, really the only thing that ever stops him is game flow and blowouts. Because, I mean, if anyone would ever keep a game close against these guys, I mean, the sky's the limit.
Yeah, and we might actually see that with West Virginia actually keeping it relatively close. Baylor checks in as a 21-point home favorite. The fact that Baylor's at home is a little more concerning in the blowout department. But, Vegas kind of likes West Virginia to hang around. And if that spread holds up, if Baylor's up by, say, 20 or so, going into the fourth quarter, I mean, they're going to still have their starters in. So we've been recommending Russell, even though we've been expecting blowouts over the past 2-3 weeks, and he's still producing 40-plus fantasy points every week. So just thinking he could get 4 quarters of action just adds to his already high upside. And he's obviously the number one overall play within this slate. Another guy that I like kind of near the top there is Patrick Mahomes of Texas Tech. But he's actually, in the position that Seth Russell usually is. That is with the blowout factor as Texas Tech is playing Kansas this week, favored by 31. So, I mean, as the tiebreaker, I like Russell here in a more competitive game. Should see 4 quarters and, go over 40 fantasy points once again.
Yeah, I mean, that poor team, they were down by, 45 points at halftime last week. Now they get Texas Tech. So, I mean, maybe a good time to get some young guys, give some good young guys a chance here because it's not going to be pretty. Coming up next, we've got Dak Prescott from Mississippi State, 8,600 FanDuel, same price on DraftKings. And you mentioned here a similar type of situation where it's against a bad defense, but it's an offense that is capable of scoring points and keeping this one at least relatively close.
Yeah, so I would like Dak Prescott more as a per dollar value on FanDuel at 8,600, where he's 1,200 cheaper than Seth Russell. He's only 400 less on DraftKings, so I'm really going to gravitate towards Russell over there. So, he's a dual threat quarterback. We saw him last year. He was great fantasy. Has been kind of up and down this year, hasn't had tremendous upside, but then again, Mississippi State has been blowing out teams, or they've had pretty tough matchups, so he hasn't really had to been utilized like he was last season. But this is a game we could see that upside against Louisiana Tech, who has a notoriously bad defense. They've kind of gotten shredded by teams like Western Kentucky and anyone with a pulse on offense. So Mississippi State checks in as 2 touchdown favorites, still a relatively competitive game, and most of that offensive production really flows through Prescott, whether it's him taking goal line carries, running design draws, or through the air. So I really like him in this matchup at 8,600 on DraftKings and FanDuel.
Definitely nice to get a quarterback that gets goal line carries there as well. Next up, Joe Huebner from Kansas State, 71 on FanDuel, only 5,700 on DraftKings. And you mentioned there that he's more of a tournament play on FanDuel due to price, but a great QB2 due to his price on DraftKings. And had 4 rushing touchdowns against TCU last week. And now once again, a decent matchup for a guy that's a focal point of the offense.
Yeah, speaking of quarterbacks that get goal line carries, that's what Huebner proved last week against TCU. So, like I said, more of a tournament option on FanDuel. Great QB2 play on DraftKings at 5,700, still way too cheap over there. And, this really isn't your father's Oklahoma defense, so to speak. They've been giving up a lot of points to, some pretty mediocre or so competition. We saw them against Tulsa, struggled a little bit. Texas last week even kind of, got some things going on offense when they had been struggling in the weeks previous. So Kansas State at home, this should be a tight game. It's a 4-point spread. Oklahoma's favored. And Huebner, he's, been the focal point of their offense, and I'm expecting that to carry over once again this week, and maybe he could get multiple touchdowns again. So 5,700 on DraftKings, I'm going to take the plunge with him.
Yeah, real nice value there. Next up, Derrick Henry from Alabama 73 on FanDuel, 73 also on DraftKings. And like you mentioned here, he's a perfect cash game play because he's been very consistent throughout the season. Gets a nice matchup against Texas A&M where it's expected to be a close game, just a 4-point favorite there for Alabama. So certainly game flow should be in his favor, and even if Alabama does get a lead, that's even better for Henry's prospects late in the game.
Yeah, if you just look at his fantasy point average, which is 22 on the season, and then his price point is 7,300, you just have a fantastic value play within that. And this is kind of a slate where there aren't really those top-tier running backs like Leonard Fournette or Nick Chubb, obviously because Nick Chubb's injured, if you saw that replay video last week where he tore his ACL. Yeah, note to ABC on that. Give a little bit of a warning that this is graphic footage before you show a replay like that. So, yeah. But anyway, as I digress, Derrick Henry, 7,300 on both sites. Great per dollar pick. He's probably one of the top backs in this slate. You could argue Dalvin Cook for that spot of Florida State, but I think Henry has a pretty similar projection. Decent matchup here against Texas A&M, and he's quite a bit cheaper than Dalvin Cook, so I'm going to put him as my top running back of this early slate on both sides.
Yeah, another guy in a great spot here who has been kind of a victim of game flow as well, but still put up big-time numbers, especially in the last couple of weeks, last 3 weeks there. Shock Linwood, 81 on FanDuel, 72 on DraftKings. I mean, he's electric. The guy's he's fast. He can make big plays. And, he's been getting a decent amount of volume here as well. So it's not like he's a guy that's dependent on that one big play to pay out that salary.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that he's consistently ripping those big plays too, and it really isn't that much of a surprise. It's pretty sustainable within this Baylor offense because they pass to set up the run. Things just open up perfectly for him, and he's the perfect running back for this type of offense. So the fact that this could be a close game, as we said before, really helps Linwood's value as well. The last time Baylor, or I guess the only time they were in a semi-close game, was against Texas Tech this season. Linwood went for 20 carries, 221 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Obviously, West Virginia a little bit better of a defense, or a run defense, I should say, than Texas Tech, but they're still ranked pretty mediocre. So Shock Linwood, if he sees 20 or so carries, which he could in this game, should be another easy 150-plus yards, maybe 2 touchdowns.
I like that. And then a nice value play here. FanDuel only. Quadri Olesen on FanDuel here. Now the starter for Pittsburgh at running back. And James Conner, another injury, season-ending injury with him. So guy stepping into a new role, still priced kind of like a backup here. And it's not a great matchup, but at that price, though, you should be able to pay off his salary.
Yeah, and Georgia Tech, they've been, as the seasons went along, they've been more and more kind to opposing running games. They gave up like 3 touchdowns to the Duke running back. Procise of Notre Dame kind of made his name. His coming out party was against Georgia Tech with nearly 200 yards. And Marquise Williams of North Carolina, the running quarterback there, ran for 145 against them. So I think this matchup sets up pretty well for Olesen in this run-first offense. Even though James Conner isn't there anymore, their superstar running back due to injury, as you said, this is still a run-first offense. Pittsburgh is going to want to establish that. And Olesen, he's averaged 85 yards and a touchdown over the past 2 games, including over 100 yards in 2 weeks ago. So I think he can reach that again. He's certainly going to get the carries to help him get there. And 5,400 on FanDuel, he's one of the better value plays. And this is kind of a week where, as we said, there's not many top-end guys that you love. So, taking the value with Derrick Henry there is a good choice. And there's not really many, value plays under 6K there. So I think Olesen is probably the better of that group. And 5,400 there is a safe RB2 play.
Yeah, makes sense there. Anybody else you got at running back here?
I do. I have the Wisconsin running back. I like him more on DraftKings. I'm going to butcher his name, so apologies in advance. It's Ogunbowale, Ogunbowale. So if you want to look that up. 4.9K. Their starting running back, Tywan Deal, the freshman, was hurt last week, questionable to play. And these 2 guys have been, kind of sharing carries to begin with. So I think Ogunbowale is going to step up to the plate, get a majority of the carries against Purdue. which is a pretty good matchup. Wisconsin's favored by 24. Otherwise, another DraftKings play that I really like. As we see week to week, you need some cheap guys to fill in your lineup in the flex spot. And I think Morrow of Washington State is a pretty good pick in that spot. 3.4K on FanDuel. They're playing Oregon State, favored by 8, 63 over under, so it's a reasonably high total. And Morrow, he's fairly active in the passing game. As we know, DraftKings full point PPR. You could get 5 receptions, 30 yards, and then add to it with maybe a touchdown run around the goal line. So 3.4K near minimum salary. I'm willing to take that risk.
Yeah, makes sense. And then wide receiver, hopefully you're not surprised by this play. Corey Coleman, I mean, he's been absolutely ridiculous. $8,600 on FanDuel, 82 on DraftKings. I mean, he's easily your top receiver, and it's a similar situation to Seth Russell. I mean, these guys were tearing it up in the first half last week, but I mean, everyone was tearing it up in that ridiculously good matchup. So he didn't need to do anything in the second half. But like you said, if this one stays close, I mean, we could see. I mean, I don't even know what the word is for the numbers that you could see from Corey Coleman if this one stays close for even 3 quarters.
Yeah, it's scary to think of his upside. I mean, we already know what his floor is, which is 150 yards, 1 to 2 touchdowns. And now if he actually sees 4 quarters, I mean, 200 plus, 2 to 3 touchdowns really isn't out of the picture. So I think this is a pretty easy pick as your top overall wide receiver play. And I think it makes sense to kind of work him into a lot of lineups. And, furthering his cause, I don't think the competition at the top end of wide receiver is very good this week. Usually we have a couple guys that we're kind of considering pivoting around. But Roger Lewis is on DraftKings. He's actually $200 more expensive than Coleman. He's someone else you could consider. But he's not on FanDuel. So, I mean, that makes the decision a little easier over there. I think I'm going to have Coleman on pretty much all of my cash game lineups.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue having him in there, locking in that security. Sheldon Gibson, fairly priced guy in that same kind of shootout there. 6,100 on FanDuel, 47 on DraftKings. I mean, the Baylor defense looked great last week, but, I mean, this is also one of the worst teams in football they faced last week. And they're definitely a team that does give up some points at times. And Sheldon Gibson has got to be the top option in that passing game for West Virginia.
Yeah, and he should be a product of game flow this week with West Virginia just trying to keep pace with Baylor, probably passing the ball more than usual. And on top of that, their go-to running back, Smallwood, is questionable. So that might, lead a little more emphasis on the passing game for West Virginia. And Gibson's really emerged as one of their top wide receivers, or I should say most consistent wide receivers. So 4,700 on DraftKings. I really like that salary.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense there. Next up, Isaiah Jones from ECU, 59 on FanDuel, 58 on DraftKings. 10-plus catches in 3 games here, you mentioned. So an elite PPR guy with a nice high floor. And like you said also, this Tulsa defense has just not looked good at all. Yeah,
and this is actually the highest over-under of this early slate by a couple points over that Baylor matchup. It's a 78 over-under between East Carolina and Tulsa. East Carolina is favored by 11 at home. And this Tulsa defense is just, I mean, they got blown up week 1 by Florida Atlantic. And Oklahoma hung a lot of points on them. Houston, Greg Ward ran for something like 12 touchdowns or whatever. Or maybe it was 4. But, Isaiah Jones, really like him in this spot. I mean, he even had 13 catches, 130-plus yards against one of the best corners in the nation when ECU played Florida. So you have to really like his prospects here. Like I said in the article, 10-plus receptions, 100-plus yards, 1 to 2 touchdowns really isn't out of the picture here.
Yeah, makes sense there. Anybody else at wide receiver before we get to the awesome tight end position?
Yeah, you have to look at the other side of that matchup, the East Carolina-Tulsa game. And some of the Tulsa receivers stepping up with Kevin Lucas out for the season. You have Garrett. He's kind of their mainstay possession wide receiver. We'll be seeing the red zone looks. He's a little more expensive than the other guy, Atkinson, especially on DraftKings. Atkinson's only 5.4K. They're both 6.6K on FanDuel. But, as we said, that's one of the higher projected scoring games of this slate. So it makes sense to look at Tulsa, just trying to stay in that game. Some of their wide receivers stepping up. I think I'm leaning more towards Atkinson. Otherwise, you have Ridley. This is a FanDuel special. Ridley of Alabama. His minimum salary and he has 3 touchdowns in 3 straight games. Last 2 games combined, 14 receptions, 260 yards, and 2 touchdowns. So, I mean, Alabama, A&M, this should be a competitive game. And, Ridley could get open and play action. And, Derrick Henry can't do everything. So Ridley is their only threat in the passing game. And I'm expecting him to kind of maintain his scoring streak here. So he's minimum salary on FanDuel. Definitely looking that way.
All right. I like that. Moving over to tight end, unfortunately, once again, no Tyler Higbee here, at least as far as FanDuel goes, where you have to play tight end. So you've got Rodney Mills in here from UMass, and he was a guy that we weren't sure was going to play last week, and then he did end up playing and had a great game as well. So with the lack of consistency with Tyler Higbee in that passing attack, you mentioned here, it just kind of makes sense to lock in Rodney Mills because he's probably the most talented tight end on this slate.
Yeah, he's kind of, I'd like to call him the Tyler Higbee light here. A little less consistent, but still, he's involved heavily in this team that likes to pass a lot in UMass. They have a pretty good matchup against conference opponent Kent State. So I think he'll be in line for another, 6-7 receptions, maybe 100 yards, and he could get into the end zone this week. So I think he probably makes the most sense out of anyone at the tight end position if you can fit him in your cap space.
Yeah, so you're saying he's like the Travis Kelce to Tyler Higbee being Rob Gronkowski.
Yeah,
basically.
I'd say that's a very fair comparison, actually. And, if Gronkowski isn't in the game slate like he wasn't 2 weeks ago with New England on a bye, you dip down to Travis Kelce. I mean, that's very fair comparison.
All right, makes sense. And then your bare minimum cheap play, Gus Wally. And you mentioned here he's inconsistent, but that's a lot of the reason why he's absolute minimum at $2,000 there. So risky play, but one that I'm guessing you're fine with in GPPs if you have to save the salary to bump up elsewhere.
Yeah, you just have that million maker on your mind, don't you?
That million's mine this week. One of them. One of those.
All right. You heard it here first on the College Football Podcast. That Big Italy 42. Come Monday night, we'll be first in the millionaire maker on DraftKings.
Or FanDuel, one of the two.
Yeah, I guess, it really doesn't matter. I mean, you'll take the million either way, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, Wally, I've kind of had a love-hate relationship with him this season. He is minimum salary, so it's tempting. A lot of it's just going to depend on what you can do with that extra $1,300. I mean, if it leads to some upside at other places that normally you wouldn't be able to get to, then sure, go ahead and take a chance. That's probably more for tournaments. But as I said in the article, Wally's been more involved in competitive games, like against Auburn and stuff earlier this season, SEC opponents. Louisiana Tech, they aren't necessarily the same caliber, but it's a 14-point spread here, so it should be a competitive game. Louisiana Tech, not the greatest defense. We aren't really sure what Wally's going to do, but for a minimum salary shot in the dark, he's the only guy down here with any sort of fantasy relevance at all. So, if you need a value play, I think he's the guy.
Yeah, and even if he puts up a complete dud for you, it's probably not going to kill your lineup at just $2,000 if you can turn a mid-tier guy into a top-tier guy with the extra salary. So that's going to wrap things up here for us this week. Find us on Twitter at DF Cafe. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. Check out the rest of our great content at dailyfantasycafe.com.